It's been 62 years of obstruction. We know that the government agencies, and specifically the CIA, they have a vested interest in not fully disclosing all the information they have about the JFK assassination and what they knew about Lee Harvey Oswald.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown, but before we get to the interview, we'd love it if you'd hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review because we love your feedback. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works and how to affect real change. Without further ado, here's the interview. Craig Iffland, welcome to the Signal Sitdown.
Thanks.
Well, cheers. It's good to see you, old friend.
Yes, great to see you.
We are sipping whiskey because this might be the last podcast we ever record, either one of us, because we're going to be talking about the JFK assassination. The campaign promise that I think attracted so many people in the fringe middle, if you want to call it that.
Yeah,
right?
The lunatic fringe middle.
Exactly. Yeah. The people who believe that JFK was killed by the CIA, but aren't necessarily on board with some of the socially conservative aspects of Donald Trump's platform. Well, they came on to Donald Trump's team with the endorsement of Bobby Kennedy, and Trump promised to reveal what actually happened with the assassination of JFK, the assassination of RFK, and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. You are the friend who knows the most about the JFK assassination in particular. Obviously, President Trump is working to answer on that promise by releasing this executive order, creating a plan to declassify more of these documents. First off, the executive order. I mean, how is this actually going to work? How long are we going to have to wait to see this planning stage come out?
Yeah, well, I mean, the executive order basically calls for a plan to be submitted to the president, authored by the Attorney General and the Director of National Intelligence. So, I mean, I'm hoping that will be Pam Bondi and Tulsi Gabbard. And so he's asking for, within 15 days of the executive order, which would be February 15th, I think, or something like that, for them to submit a plan for how they're going to go about declassifying the JFK records. And then he gives a later date for the MLK and RFK records.
Mm-hmm. And these records, from what I understand, there is a JFK file.
Yeah.
But should this executive order go beyond that? What else should be caught in this giant dragnet that the Trump administration is trying to pull through the intel agencies to get people transparency on this?
Yeah, right. So, yeah, I think it's a very important distinction to be made. So the JFK files, when people speak about that colloquially, are roughly 3,500 records that are still redacted that are housed in the National Archives right now. And those records were identified during the course of a review that was generated by the JFK Act in 1992. Okay, so those are the files that ostensibly count as part of the JFK files, all right? And they're basically the JFK collection at the National Archives. But there's other records that are related to the assassination that were not included in that collection because either people didn't know about them or because the review board that was tasked with identifying new records were not aware of them, or the agencies basically kind of waited them out and never delivered the records that they requested. So there's still outstanding records that we need to be able to identify and try to, get out of the agencies. So I think that with respect to the executive order, the first and most important thing is that it both includes the JFK collection in the National Archives and any outstanding records that are relevant to our understanding of the assassination.
Mm-hmm. And this would include certain documentation on Lee Harvey Oswald that happens well before the shooting that might tell us more about his story and how he came to be this individual.
Exactly.
Whenever you think of his involvement in the assassination, that's a pretty important story to tell, right? This isn't just happening in a vacuum. And I feel like that's kind of the American public's issue with this. I mean, this fight for transparency has been going on for nearly 62 years now.
Yeah.
And from the start, the government wanted you to believe that this was all just happening in a vacuum and that the American public was either unworthy of this type of transparency. They were unable to handle the truth. That's the second option. Or 3, that it's always, this massive concern of national security. And I think number 3 is obviously the excuse that they've made in public, but I have a feeling that it's either 1 or 2 that's really motivating them to propagate this third narrative, that it's a matter of national security, and that's why the American public shouldn't know. But 62 years on, I mean, we still don't know exactly what happened that day. Any red flags that are going up for you as we start this process? Because as we've said, like, there's been different efforts to declassify as much as possible. I think the ARB, which we'll talk about in the future, did a lot, right? I think they declassified some 2 million documents when all was said and done. Nevertheless, these different iterations haven't given us the full story. And so, and they've been, railroaded, or obstacles have been put in their way every single time Congress or the executive branch tries to act on this. So are there any red flags that you have right now? Yeah,
well, I mean, I would just say in general, of course, it's been 62 years of obstruction. So we know that the government agencies, and specifically the CIA, they have a vested interest in not being, not fully disclosing all the information they have about the JFK assassination and what they knew about Lee Harvey Oswald. So I think just in general, one sort of standing red flag is the fact that they are demonstrably opposed to releasing these records. They fought them tooth and nail. I mean, it took a incredible act of Congress in the JFK Act, in which Congress actually decided to tell the executive branch, agencies within the executive branch, look, you have to declassify records. I'm not aware of any other piece of legislation that compels the executive branch to release records. So I think, one standing red flag is just, we know that they don't want certain records to come out. But I would say, in terms of following up on this executive order, there'd be like 2 things. One is, if the declassification plan keeps everything within the boundaries of, like, the National Security Council, and there isn't someone in the administration who is close to the president that is really determined to getting full public disclosure, that I think I would be very concerned about. So if there's just some team within the National Security Council that's going to come up with a plan, and not, well, Tulsi is going to be, spearheading this thing and she's going to go after it, I would be nervous about that.
And it seems like the president knows that to a certain degree when he's saying that Bobby Kennedy Jr. was going to have an outsized role in making sure this declassification happens.
Yeah.
You think of the team that Trump has put around himself on matters of intelligence. John Ratcliffe, who is probably the best person that Trump had in the intelligence apparatus in the first administration, going to the CIA. Tulsi Gabbard at Director of National Intelligence, which seems like, her nomination, she's going to be confirmed, it looks like, increasingly, especially with Senator Susan Collins' endorsement. And then, of course, you have Bobby, as aforementioned, and some people on the Trump team who I know are really hungry to follow through on it.
And Kash Patel as well.
Kash Patel is a perfect example, right? Yeah. That is an FBI director who knows that restoring public trust in the institution starts with some sort of leveling with the American people and the previous mistakes. And I mean, Hoover alone deserves a whole nother episode of this podcast.
For sure.
But I mean, what declassification could mean for the American people? I mean, it seems like the error of our institutions as of late has been the way to maintain trust and public trust is to continually shift the narrative, shift the goalposts, obfuscate as much as possible, and say, no, we were right the entire time. This was what happened during the wars on terror. This is what has seemed to have happened with the JFK assassination. And I think a lot of people in the American public think that a prerequisite to restoring trust in these institutions is for the institutions to finally be honest with us, whether that's about Russiagate or that's about COVID or that's about these assassinations.
Yeah, right. No, I mean, I think that full transparency on what the government has with respect to JFK, RFK, and MLK would be it would demonstrate, right, that public interest, the citizens' interest in knowing about historically significant events in their nation is more important than the sources, methods, and reputations of government agencies, right? Mm-hmm. So our interest, the public interest in transparency, from which we can both learn and also hold people accountable, is more important than protecting the kind of, bureaucratic initiatives of particular agencies or hiding what mistakes they may have made.
And I know we said already, like this is a matter of trust, right? So they're afraid of losing trust from the public. But it's got to be beyond that. I mean, what are these people exactly afraid of, right? Are they afraid that people are going to storm the Capitol once they find out what happened about the CIA, like about the Kennedy assassination, if the CIA was involved or not, or to what extent, whatever? Like, what are they afraid of here?
Yeah. Well, I think in part it's also just about precedent. Mm-hmm. So, in terms of intelligence agencies, they don't want people to know what they're doing, right? It's part of like their security measures. So any kind of yielding to public transparency, kind of weakens their ability to keep things secret and sets up a precedent for them to not be able to continue to make things secret in the future. And of course, there are all sorts of incentives for that. Some might be completely legitimate. It's concerns about national security. We're doing, good things, but we can't let people know about them. But oftentimes it can be, look, we've done some bad stuff that will, create problems for our reputation. We don't want people to know about that. And of course, the first route to holding anyone accountable is that what they're doing. So it's kind of absurd and ridiculous that for over 60 years we've created this culture in Washington where folks within the intelligence community, right, can shield their activities from public review and therefore public accountability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems to me that if this happens, Trump's approval ratings are going to go up 6 to 10%. If it actually follows through with, if he's able to follow through with it.
Yeah.
I don't know. What say you on that front? Because just someone at least letting the cat out of the bag, being honest for once.
Yeah. Look, Washington. I think complete transparency on MLK, RFK, and JFK. I mean, look. Part of Trump's victory was the podcast, generation of people that are listening to, Rogan and Theo Vaughn and these other folks, right? So that's going to be a huge victory for him and something that he can point to. And really, it's like no other president has taken that, have taken that level of initiative to actually expose what the intelligence agencies have done in our name. And if you add JFK, MLK, and RFK to whatever went down with Russiagate and being completely transparent about that, I think he's going to win a lot of
or even
votes.
His own assassination attempts.
Well, there you go. Yeah,
it's unbelievable that we know. I mean, that was. I was there on the ground in Butler, and that was out of the news cycle within 72 hours. As a journalist, I kind of felt gypped in a way.
Right.
I'm kidding, of course. But I figured that it was going to be in the news cycle for much longer, and everyone just kind of moved on, and then it happened again, and everyone moved on just as quickly. Yeah. But we haven't moved on from the JFK assassination, which I think is really interesting. And I think part of it is just how brutal it was, and of course, Trump's assassination attempt is different than actually a full assassination of the sitting president.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, I mean, that was the closest we've gotten since the 1980s to a president being assassinated. And the JFK assassination has had a way of sticking with us.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And I guess it's now we should probably turn to November of 1963, November 22nd, 1963.
Right.
That's the day that President Kennedy gets assassinated. He's in Dallas.
Yeah.
What led up to that moment?
Yeah. So, obviously he's running up to an election year in 1964. He had barely won Texas in his previous election. And so part of his visit to Dallas was to kind of boost his reelection chances. And, Dallas was a very reactionary place within the United States at the time. When in anticipation of his arrival, there was a full-length newspaper ad taken out with a picture of Kennedy saying wanted for treason, and with a list of offenses against him because, he had been too soft on communism, specifically, that he had given a no invasion pledge to Cuba as a result of trying to resolve the Cuban Missile Crisis. So he knew that, he needed to win Texas and he needed to show his face there. And also very significant was that it was going to be one of the first campaign events where he was going to really prominently display Jackie. And so, that was one of the reasons why, both because the weather was good and because he wanted people to see Jackie, he didn't want this kind of bubble on the limousine. The bubble wasn't like bulletproof or anything. Mm-hmm. So, but in any case, he wanted people to see her. He thought that she was good for his political capital. And, just a little kind of America First anecdote. So, it's a very famous dress, this pink Chanel dress, French designer, but they made sure to make it in America because people would be, pissed off if if it was made by somebody in France. So anyway, so that's why they're in Dallas, and that's why they have such a long motorcade, like a 10-mile parade route, because he wanted everybody to see him with Jackie. Mm-hmm. And that parade route obviously took him through downtown Dallas and ultimately Dealey Plaza, where the assassination occurs.
Dealey Plaza. I believe we still have that dress somewhere, right? Is that?
Yeah, it's somewhere.
It's somewhere.
Yeah. She didn't change the dress also, after, it was all bloody. Mm-hmm. And you can see in the photos of Lyndon Johnson taking the oath, the presidential oath, she's there like in her bloody dress. And people are like, well, do you want to change? And she said, no, I want them to see what they did to Jack.
Yeah.
Strong woman.
Definitely.
Strong woman.
And lionized for so many years. She's kind of like, when you hear the word First Lady, you kind of jump to Jackie Kennedy. And I don't know exactly why that is, but it's true. I mean, this is just a powerful part of the, it's not a founding myth, but it's, a very important myth in our history, right? Like this fascination with Jackie Kennedy, even though Jackie Kennedy for this first few years had been more of a behind the scenes person and not this public presence that we think of her as in a strange way.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So Dealey Plaza, that's where the assassination occurs.
Right. Yeah.
Witness testimony at the time varies wildly, especially from the Warren Commission narrative.
Yeah, I mean, so you can see videos from Dealey Plaza in which, a variety of people run almost immediately up the grassy knoll towards the picket fence there, which is, the location where many people suspect was a second shooter. And, generally when they the Warren Commission and other investigations asked people who were there at Dealey Plaza, you more or less get a significant amount of people say, look, I heard shots from the grassy knoll, and a significant amount of people who say, I heard shots in the direction of the Texas School Book Depository, which was behind President Kennedy. But I think what's very important about like what happened there at Dealey Plaza is why it went to conspiracy so quickly. Like, why did the public think that there was something amiss in the assassination? So he gets shot around 12:30. Mm-hmm. Okay. It's a roughly, speeding 6-minute drive to Parkland Memorial Hospital. Okay. So he's driven there. They bring him into the hospital room. They try to save him, but, basically half of his head is blown off. And so they know pretty quickly that he's not going to make it. And roughly 1 hour later, after, he's pronounced dead. I can't remember exactly. It might have been around 1 p.m. They pronounced him dead.
Yeah, they pronounced him dead at 1 p.m.
Yeah. So about half an hour later, they have a press conference. And in that press conference, the doctors that treated President Kennedy make some very significant statements that are like the first step towards a public conspiracy. So what they say is, one, there was a wound in his neck. And that wound was a wound of entrance. So that would indicate a shot from the front. And the White House spokesperson, who's down there, I think it's Malcolm Kildruff or something, he says, oh, so what was the shot that killed President Kennedy? And he said, well, from my understanding, it was a shot right to the head, right in the right temple. Okay. Mm-hmm. So the story that emerges from Parkland, 1 hour after the assassination is 2 shots, in the front. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And because the spokesperson says as simple as a bullet straight through the head, but he's pointing to the right temple.
Yes. And he later says also that I understood that it came in the right temple. Mm-hmm. Right. So that's the story 1 hour after the assassination. But by the end of the evening, once you get to the autopsy done in Bethesda by Navy doctors, suddenly there are no shots from the front. Everything came from the rear. Okay, so already there, that mismatch of reporting caused people to be suspicious, right? The second thing that made people very suspicious of a public conspiracy right after the assassination is on the eve of the assassination, there was a group of Cuban exiles who knew Oswald and had interacted with him in the summer of '63. They contact major media outlets saying, we know this guy, we know what he's about, and they suggest very, very strongly that he's a Castro supporter and he's likely an agent working at the direction of Castro. And the media runs wild with this, okay? So right at by the end of the day on November 22nd, you've got a mismatch about where the bullets are coming from. And you also have this story about Oswald, who had defected to Russia, but then came back to the U.S., but who was a big Castro supporter, who might have been a Castro agent, is identified as the one that is responsible for the assassination. Then 2 days later, he's being escorted under police custody, and he gets shot at point-blank range by a kind of low-level gangster club owner named Jack Ruby, and he's killed, right? Mm-hmm. So conspiracy was already in the air the night of the assassination, but 2 days later, Oswald is killed. So it's very easy for people to say, hey, look, he got silenced, right? And why did he get silenced? So the conspiracy theories about Kennedy's assassination were, basically right out the gate, they were there. And in fact, I think it's very significant that the first big conspiracy theory, the one that I was mentioning about him being an agent of Castro, was propagated by a group of Cuban exiles who were funded by the CIA. So the first conspiracy theory about JFK was propagated by assets of the Central Intelligence Agency.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to see how quickly that narrative took root. And I mean, from what I understand, there was a massive fight over the body of JFK at the hospital. That JFK, according to Texas law, there should have been an autopsy there on the ground. And so these doctors that give the press conference are doctors that treated Kennedy, but it was not part of the autopsy.
No.
And there's basically a Mexican standoff in the hallway of this hospital over who's going to perform the autopsy of JFK.
Yeah.
The Secret Service kind of bullies local enforcement and says, nope, we're getting the body and we're getting Lyndon out of here. And LBJ takes the oath of office on the plane. They had already had that press conference about what is happening to Kennedy, and quickly thereafter released that LBJ has been sworn in as president of the United States.
Yeah.
There was a full-on fight.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't remember the guy's name now. It could have been, Earl Wade or something like that. No, it wasn't Wade. Wade was the district attorney of Roe v. Wade fame, actually. But yeah, the county coroner was there, and he basically said, hey, look, this is a local crime, and by Texas law, we should do the autopsy here. And the Secret Service agents basically kind of, different stories, but, either they threw him up against the wall or they drew weapons or what have you, and basically said, we're taking the body. And I think that, if you want to I think a very common theme in how the government dealt with Kennedy's assassination was, we need to have it tightly controlled by the federal government, the executive. So they did not want to have some Texas coroner do the autopsy. They wanted to have control over the autopsy because, even at that moment, they didn't really know. I mean, they didn't have a suspect at, an hour and a half after the assassination. So it's like, well, we don't know who's behind this. And so as a result, Lyndon Johnson, J. Edgar Hoover, they were very, very concerned with getting control over all the aspects of the case so that it wouldn't go down avenues or lines of inquiry that they thought were politically not beneficial for them, or perhaps problematic. I mean, it could be not politically beneficial, but I think their major concern was if people are out there talking about a communist conspiracy that Castro or the Soviets were behind this, like that could jumpstart a World War III. We don't want that.
Yeah, and there's a unity of action problem too, right? Yeah. Like this is a problem that the executive of the government has been assassinated. How many irons do you want in this fire as you're trying to get to the bottom of this? And so you kind of understand the impulse. This happened to the president. The president's men want to take care of the situation, and they don't want things to boil over into World War III, as you mentioned.
Right.
Nevertheless, with especially the killing of Lee Harvey Oswald by Jack Ruby, public's kind of leaning towards some sort of conspiracy. Something more is going on here.
Yeah.
And the Warren Commission is formed to tell the public, no, we promise you nothing else is going on here.
Yeah. Yeah, no. So basically after Oswald is killed, J. Edgar Hoover and Lyndon Johnson are, we've got the transcript of the phone conversation. The audio has been, deleted accidentally, this kind of stuff. So, many things like that in the JFK case. But in that conversation, Hoover mentions to LBJ, look, we need to release something to the public that convinces them that Oswald is the assassin, because there's all these theories, flying around about a possible communist conspiracy. And the Deputy Attorney General at the time, Nicholas Katzenbach, he writes a memo to LBJ basically recommending, look, we need to create a kind of commission, a blue ribbon commission under the control of the president of esteemed individuals that can produce a report that will convince the public that Oswald acted alone, that there are no conspirators at large, and that he would have been convicted at trial.
So let me get this straight.
Yeah.
The Warren Commission investigation started with its conclusion.
Yes. It was not about figuring out the truth of the assassination. Was there a conspiracy or not? It was about validating the FBI's conclusion that it was a lone gunman. And
this was Hoover's idea.
Yeah, this was Hoover's idea.
No surprise whatsoever.
Yeah, but it was like that was the simplest solution for them to keep freedom of action. If it turned out that the Cubans were behind it, then Lyndon Johnson might have had his hands forced about doing some kind of, having some kind of response, right? But yeah, no, the Warren Commission, its purpose from the outset is, we are going to validate this idea of Oswald as a lone gunman.
So Hoover says we need to get these esteemed men together to do this quote unquote investigation.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's interesting. Hoover was not really that much in favor of the commission. This guy Katzenbach suggested it. Hoover thought it was a good idea that we issue something to convince the public. But what happened was that Lyndon Johnson started talking to some of his Washington journalist friends. And he said, well, I think we can just do an FBI report. We'll release it. It'll say it's a lone gunman. That should be enough, right? But what the journalist said was, look, people don't trust the FBI, and they also don't write that well. So basically they were like, look, you need better propagandists to push this narrative. And, also Johnson was invested in, there were also already at that point, Congress was making noise about trying to investigate the assassination itself. And so Lyndon Johnson wanted to also remove that possibility because, again, he viewed it as a political problem that he had to resolve and keep control of.
And you look at the list of these guys on the Warren Commission, I mean, it's Chief Justice Earl Warren.
Yeah.
It's Senator Russell. I mean, a building's named after him across
That's
the
right.
street.
Yeah.
These are considered lions of government at the time. I mean, these were not some random players. These were not backbenchers. These were not guys who had the reputation for being patsies of any kind.
Yeah.
And yet LBJ is able to convince these guys to serve on a commission that's supposed to do an investigation of which the conclusions are already predetermined. How does he go about doing that?
Yeah, right. So so it's interesting, you know, Earl Warren, Richard Russell, they didn't like each other. Earl Warren was, you know, a kind of a Kennedy type liberal. Richard Russell was a Southern Democrat, ardent segregationist. So they didn't like each other, and neither of them really wanted to serve on the committee. Russell didn't want to serve with Warren. Warren thought that it would be a problem because he was Chief Justice. But LBJ, again, viewing the commission as a politics thing, is like, look, I'm going to have all my buddy Southern Democrats on this, okay? But I need somebody that's really acceptable to like the Northeast liberal establishment, so I need Warren. So Warren kind of balks, and LBJ tells him, hey, look, I need you to be on this commission because right now there are people running around saying that the Soviets did this, that Castro did this, and if we don't do something, you know, we could get thrown into a war that'll kill 40 million Americans in an hour. He said, now I know you put on the uniform. I don't know if it's World War I or World War II. He's like, I know you put the uniform on for World War I, right? And I'm asking you to do it again. And so Earl Warren apparently teared up and decided to do it. And he gave the same spiel to Richard Russell when he kind of put up objections. So, you know, on the one hand, the Warren Commission was about, propagating the lone gunman theory. But for people like Earl Warren and Richard Russell, it was also about, you know, avoiding the possibility of, a nuclear war. Or at least that's the way that LBJ tried to convince them to do it. And they ultimately relented.
Well, the most interesting person, I think, on the Warren Commission was one Allen Dulles. We talked about buildings being named after people. There's a whole airport down the road.
Yeah. Well, that's John Foster, not Allen.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know this.
Yeah.
Well,
but that's okay. Their
we can
legacies
rename
are
it.
intertwined.
Listen, as long as we're in this era of iconoclasm and anything bearing the mark of Allen Dulles, I should be instantly skeptical of.
Yeah.
Including the Dulles Airport. So I apologize to the Dulles Airport, but it's not a person, so I don't feel that bad. Dulles, CIA director,
right,
who Kennedy removes from that position after allowing is an interesting word to use here, but allowing the Bay of Pigs invasion to go through, which was planned under the Eisenhower administration.
Right.
That fails miserably. Kennedy takes a lot of public blame, and he readily accepts that responsibility as chief executive. In private, especially with his brother Bobby, furious at the CIA, removes Dulles, gets his resignation, and promises to scatter the CIA into the winds.
Yeah.
Dulles is on the committee investigating the assassination of the man who he despised.
Yeah, right.
How does that happen?
Yeah, so, well, part is that Dulles lobbied to be on the commission. He was also recommended by RFK as somebody that, you know, could be on it. And, you know, it wasn't that odd in the sense that Allen Dulles, I mean, his family was kind of a huge political powerhouse in the United States. I mean, just like they have a long pedigree within government. So it's not that odd. But on the other hand, I think that Dulles, from the very beginning, was interested in protecting the CIA from, you know, kind of being forced to expose things that they didn't want to expose. I'm not saying necessarily about their involvement in the assassination, but just sources and methods. You know, he was going to be the source within the commission that would let the CIA know, you know, where, you know, what direction are we taking? What kind of things are they asking for? That kind of stuff. So, you know, Gerald Ford, for example.
Someone with some institutional knowledge who can theoretically twist some arms if, you know, the CIA wasn't being compliant, yada, yada.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, I think he wanted to be on to ensure that they didn't ask certain questions of the CIA, right?
Right, but that relationship can work both ways too.
Right.
Like,
no, that's
hey,
true. Yeah.
Hey, give us this.
Yeah, he could negotiate.
I will push them away from this.
He could negotiate because the thing is that the people that were in charge of the CIA at the time. I mean, John McCone was the CIA director. He was installed by Kennedy, but like the founding fathers of the CIA were like Allen Dulles, Richard Helms, James Jesus Angleton. So, they kind of all knew each other. So he was a good person as a liaison between the commission and the CIA. But of course, yes, he was not a fan of President Kennedy. And like both those figures I mentioned, Richard Helms and James Angleton, he was a very anti-communist, hardliner, and he did not think that Kennedy had lived up to the promises he made during the campaign to be tough on communism. And that begins with the Bay of Pigs. They thought, they had run a coup down in Guatemala in which they didn't have enough people and they didn't have enough planes. And Eisenhower didn't want them to have enough people. He didn't want them to have a lot of planes because he wanted to be covert. And the more American planes that are there, the more obvious the Americans are actually behind the action. But when it looked like actually the whole thing's going to fail, Eisenhower said, well, once you commit to something, you got to go the whole way. So he authorized more planes. So Dulles thought, let's just run the same scam with Kennedy. We know that given the restrictions he's put on us in the Bay of Pigs, it's not going to be successful. And all the advisors said that.
So 12th hour, we're going to ask for more.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. And so Kennedy, to his credit, said, yeah, they thought that I would fold under pressure. And I said, no. And so he refused. So so a lot of people, and of course, what that ended up meaning was that, 1,500 Cuban exiles are a part of that brigade in the Bay of Pigs, all, were basically imprisoned. And so there was a lot of animosity towards Kennedy for kind of failing to come through in the Bay of Pigs. Then when the Cuban Missile Crisis comes around, there are all these nuclear warheads, put into Cuba by the Russians, long backstory there. But effectively, Kennedy, instead of going for full invasion of the island, even unleashing like a nuclear attack on the island, decides, well, let's see if there's a way short of nuclear war to solve this situation. And what they came up with was, well, we'll withdraw some missiles that are close to the Soviet Union, i.e. the ones that were in Turkey. You withdraw your missiles and I won't invade Cuba. And that also was viewed as like the second betrayal of the cause for Cuban independence from communism. So Dulles and many people in the military establishment and the intelligence community viewed Kennedy as someone who was not willing to fight against the Soviets and against communism in the way that needed to happen if they were going to win.
Mm-hmm. And this is really interesting because we see this same argumentation trotted out today with how we deal with conflicts abroad, where the Bay of Pigs happen. It's a military establishment operation that the president acquiesces to, at least. And then you hit the Cuban Missile Crisis, and everybody on pro Bay of Pigs side, if you would have given us the resources, this Cuban Missile Crisis wouldn't have been happening because we would have overthrown the Cuban government. Yeah. And on the other side, you have Kennedy and people who think like him saying, no. The only reason this is happening now is because you guys launched a failed coup. And we're now having to suffer those consequences. It's no surprise whatsoever that the Cuban government is trying to go to the Russians for security assurances, knowing that it's the only power that could even possibly dream of rivaling the United States power at that point in time. Yeah. And that also brings us to the relationship that Kennedy had with Khrushchev, and that Castro had with these two leaders. That like this, even diplomatic contact with these leaders was viewed as not sufficiently anti-communist. And I think you see that today too with the Ukraine war, right? If Putin is the devil or Putin is Hitler, you can't sit down with Putin at all. And anyone who's willing to negotiate with someone like that is not sufficiently committed to the American cause.
Yeah.
Right? But meanwhile, Trump is like, I'll talk to anybody. I don't care.
Yeah, right.
And that Kennedy kind of had that same swagger, that same attitude that I'm the president of the United States. I have diplomatic powers here. I'm going to use them if I want to.
Yeah, no, and he had established, sort of clandestine back channel discussions with both Khrushchev and with Castro, and he was open to some kind of agreement with Castro that would open up economic and diplomatic relations with them if they would sort of free themselves from Soviet influence, right? So those back channels and his attempts to try to achieve some kind of understanding with the Russians and with the Cubans was also something that, although they tried to make it very clandestine, I'm sure was known by many within the foreign policy establishment, and they were not very happy with it. And I don't remember exactly when, it might be June of '63. He makes a speech here in Washington, D.C. at American University in which, he effectively states that, we need to rethink the Cold War and that we can't expect to create all across the world this, Pax Americana, backed by American weapons and bombs, right? So it was a very kind of anti-imperialist type of, speech. And I think that also, for a lot of people, signaled that he was not willing to escalate the Cold War. And that clashed with a variety of, people in the top military brass and the intelligence agencies that thought, look, this is the moment to strike. We have a huge missile advantage. We have a huge military advantage. This is the moment now to get rid of communism once and for all, forever. And Kennedy wasn't willing to do that. So,
and
again,
sadly, that's not how ideologies work.
Yeah.
But we don't even need to go into Lee Harvey Oswald and Operation Mongoose. We will later. But to say that there are opposing interests here between the establishment, the military establishment, the intelligence establishment, and the president of the United States. And Allen Dulles is kind of playing in the middle of all this at the Warren Commission. And he was an early advocate of the lone gunman theory.
Yeah,
of
right.
Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yeah. So one of the first sessions, he brought in a book that had just been written called The Assassins. And it was kind of a quasi-history of political assassinations in America. And effectively, the thesis, at least as he described it, was basically everyone that takes a shot at the president in America is usually like an unstable, psychotic person with no identifiable, political motives. It's not usually the result of a conspiracy. Okay. Mm-hmm. In which, I don't remember who it is, might be Richard Russell that says, but wasn't Lincoln's assassination part of a plot? And he's like, but it was very centered on John Wilkes Booth, So, right from the beginning, I would say that Dulles was framing things in a way, which is where the Warren Commission lands, that, we don't really know why Oswald did this. He was just kind of a lone nut that decided to take a shot at the president. We don't really understand his motives. How can you understand the motives of a psychopath?
You mean the same narrative that we're hearing about Crooks and Ryan Root?
You said it.
Interesting.
You said it.
The Warren Commission finishes its work.
Yeah.
But it doesn't do much to convince the public
that
this is what happened.
Yeah.
Few issues with the Warren Report, and I think the most famous issue is the magic bullet.
Yeah, the magic bullet.
The magic bullet asserts that there were only 3 shots fired at President Kennedy that day in Dallas. And this magic bullet theory, I guess we'll start with, what does the magic bullet theory say?
Yeah.
And this is not something that arises spontaneously. This goes through 3 or 4 different iterations before landing on the official story promulgated by the Warren Commission.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, I mean, so one thing is that, I would just say to as a premise, not as a premise, as, just a prelude, that the Warren Commission, it really did fail in quelling concerns about conspiracy, because once people read, their claims and read the report, skepticism just, it elevated massively because the story that they were telling just was not credible. But okay, so how do we get to the magic bullet? Okay, so the first story.
Well, let's go to the final story. Let's go to what the Warren Commission says first.
Okay, sure.
And then we'll see how it takes shape.
Yeah. So ultimately, what the Warren Commission says is that there are 3 shots taken by Lee Harvey Oswald from the Texas School Book Depository. So that's going to be from behind the president to his right. One of the shots is going to sail high, miss its target, hit a curb, causing some shrapnel to jump up and cut a guy named James Tigg in his cheek, okay? Another shot is going to hit Kennedy in the head. That's going to be the kill shot. And another shot is going to hit Kennedy in his back, exit out his neck right under his Adam's apple, enter into Governor Connolly's back, right, sort of near the right armpit, break 4 inches of a rib or something like that, exits out his right nipple, right under his right nipple, okay? Shatters his wrist, and then embeds in his left thigh. And they're going to actually find that bullet in the Parkland Hospital on a stretcher, and the bullet's going to look basically completely pristine.
So this is the stretcher that Governor Connolly was on.
Yeah,
allegedly after getting hit.
Yeah,
and it's in perfect, pristine condition.
Right, exactly.
And this bullet enters Kennedy lower on the back, then it comes out the neck, then it turns to the right and hits Connolly, and then it goes up again, and then it drops severely down to hit his wrist, ricochets off, though shattering the bone, and into the thigh.
Yeah.
Pretty creative, in
Very
my
creative,
opinion.
Yeah.
And that idea took some time to develop, obviously, as you were hinting at.
Yeah.
How does this magic bullet theory develop?
Yeah. So, the FBI's original story is, look, there are 3 shots. And why did they say there are 3 shots? Because they found 3 shells in the Texas School Book Depository, put there just so you knew, okay, exactly how many shots there were. Don't pick up any evidence, just leave it there for the government to find. But in any case, so what they said is, okay, 1 shot hits Kennedy in the back, 1 shot hits Kennedy in the head, and then 1 shot hits Connolly, causing all his wounds. Okay, so why did they say that? They said that because they based their shots on the autopsy that was done in Bethesda. And in the autopsy that was done in Bethesda, the FBI agents who basically wrote up a summary of what happened, that's all that they heard about. They only heard that there was a shot in the back, okay, and there was a shot in the head. They missed the neck wound. So why did the autopsy doctors miss the neck wound? Well, when they were at Parkland, the Parkland doctors had expanded the neck wound in order to perform a tracheotomy to help the president breathe. Okay, so they had known that, the autopsy doctors had known that there was a tracheotomy, so they just never thought about it as a bullet wound, right? Mm-hmm. Given the fact that it had been, roughly when they start the autopsy, it's about 6-7 hours after the press conference, you might have thought that they would have known that the doctors of Parkland were already out there saying there was a shot in the neck, okay? Mm-hmm. But for whatever reason, or they didn't realize it, okay? So that's the FBI's story, which in no way accounts for this neck wound, all right? So now when the Warren Commission gets a hold of it, right, they now do have to deal with the neck wound, okay? So what do? Well, okay, we can't have more than 3 bullets, because if we got more than 3 bullets, then we got a conspiracy, because there are only 3 shells found in the Texas School Book Depository. And if our purpose is to preserve the narrative that Oswald acted alone, we can't have more than 3 bullets, all right? So if you've got 1 bullet hitting him in the head and 1 bullet hitting Connolly, Then you're going to need a bullet that enters Kennedy's back, right under the right shoulder blade, and then somehow, without hitting bone, exits out of his, right under his Adam's apple. Okay, that's the way you're going to at first solve the problem. And in one of the first meetings of the Warren Commission, they talk about this. Mm-hmm. And the chief counsel, J. Lee Rankin, says, well, we already have this problem with the bullet because it enters in under the right shoulder blade, but then it somehow, I don't know how it turns upward and exits out of his neck, right? So already the Warren Commission is aware that there's something problematic with the trajectory of this bullet.
Richard Russell doesn't believe this story.
No.
Governor Connolly doesn't believe this story.
No. LBJ doesn't believe the story. Mm-hmm. The problem was, though, that many of the people thought that was completely bogus, but they didn't really, I guess, make the connection that it implied a conspiracy. Mm-hmm. So even right there, you already have a problem. But then late in the commission's deliberations, right before they're about to wrap up the report, they discover this guy, James Tigg, who had been wounded from a stray bullet. The FBI knew about this, okay, but they didn't tell anybody at the Warren Commission. Basically, what happened was there was a big news story that came out, and so the Warren Commission had to deal with it. So now they had one bullet missed, so now you got to make two bullets do all the work. One hits Kennedy in the head, and now we got to have that bullet that already was problematic going down through the right under the right shoulder blade, somehow going upward through the neck, and then going back downward through Connolly and causing all this damage. And then if you add to that the fact that the bullet they claimed that did all that was completely pristine, it was just simply not credible. And it was not credible for the doctors that worked on Connolly. In the Warren Commission, Arlen Specter, who's the author of the single bullet theory, when he asked them, do you think that a bullet, forget whether or not it went through Kennedy, he just said, could a single bullet have caused all the damage that you observed in Governor Connolly? And Connolly's doctor said, no way. And when they did ballistics tests on, like, let's just fire this kind of bullet into a wrist of an individual, what happens to the bullet? In every case, it like split in half. So it just, I mean, it didn't work. It didn't work.
And this, I believe the doctor who performed those tests on cadaver wrist bones was an incredibly respected and decorated field doctor from World War II.
Yeah, it was a ballistics guy, gun
guy as well, and he does all of this, and it's not included.
Yeah, and they suppressed that. Yeah, they suppressed that. They called him back for another investigation in the mid-'70s. Mm-hmm. But in any case, yeah.
But then you get to the question of Lee Harvey Oswald, right? This is the lone gunman theory. There's so many weird connections with Lee Harvey Oswald, and how many Lee Harvey Oswalds there appears to be.
Right.
I think the three theories that you can kind of sum up everything that's been said about Lee Harvey Oswald is: one, the lone gunman theory. Mm-hmm. Two, he was a patsy of the CIA or of the Cuban government. Or three, he was an active participant in how this actually went down.
Right.
Lee Harvey Oswald, I mean, what have we learned about him? What should we make of this bizarre tale of connections with Cuba and the USSR and the intelligence agencies here in the United States? I mean, this seems like one of the best connected people I've ever met.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, no, I mean, so it's very difficult, because everybody wants Oswald to be something, that works with whatever, theory they have about the assassination. So I'll just make a plug. There's a great book that just came out called The Oswald Puzzle by a guy named Larry Hancock. Great book. I think one of the best books on the Kennedy assassination. He doesn't give a theory of the assassination. It's basically a biography of Oswald. But what I would say, just to give like a sort of the briefest of bios about Oswald, is that, he grew up without a father, didn't know his father, kind of lower middle class background, Southern. He moved, he was in New York for a little while, never did particularly well in school, but he was a very avid reader. Everybody testifies to that. He claims to have read, started reading Marx at like 15. Okay. And he was a guy, he was a big dreamer. I think he liked the idea of adventure. He wanted to do something with his life. And so he doesn't finish high school. He enlists in the Marines, basically because he wants to see the world. And while he's in the Marines, he starts to learn Russian. He's still reading all this communist stuff. Everybody in his platoons and all that, they kind of are aware. They call him Comrade Oswald and this kind of stuff. And he's kind of planning and saving his money because in the end, he wants to see what's it like to be in Russia. He wants to live there, okay? Because it's like, okay, well, this is like the communist government. What's it like? All right, so after he gets out of the Marines, he heads to Helsinki. And why am I mentioning that? It's significant because Helsinki was like the only place that you could get a visa into Russia in like within a week, okay? So it's a little bit, surprising that he knew about that. But in any case, he gets over to Russia. He does a lot of very theatrical things in order to kind of convince the Russians of his bona fides, that he's really in support of communism, that he's, he wants to be there. He wants to be a citizen of the USSR. And eventually they concede and let him enter into the Soviet Union. And they give him like a non-citizen status for a year or so. In the end, he ends up spending 2.5 years there. Okay. Marries a gal, has a kid. But he becomes disillusioned because Oswald was, your kind of consummate contrarian quarreler. In the end, he was still American, and so he was an individualist, and he became disillusioned with the Soviets because he saw the kind of totalitarian impulse that existed there. He didn't like all the party meetings that you had to go to as a factory worker in the factory that he worked at. So, and he argued with his friends there, and people have written books on it, recounting their time with Oswald about how he tended to take, sort of the American side of things. So he comes back after 2.5 years to the United States, and, his view is there are a lot of problems with the Soviet government. And there are a lot of problems with the US government. And he starts writing a lot. And, when you read the stuff that, that Oswald produced, he never published anything. I mean, the guy was not like some nut job. Okay. It's not like if anybody's ever,
this is not a screed of some.
No, it's not.
This is not in preparation to write a manifesto to release after you've killed the president.
Yeah, no, it's not like that at all. I mean, basically, he's writing a lot about what are the positives of the Soviet system and what are the positives of the American system and how could you combine them, right? How can you find a way, to combine the best of both of these governments? Now, he was still kind of a self-described communist, but he thought that the Russian government was not living up to that ideal. Okay, so he was always on the lookout for where, where's the best form of government? I mean, are there other places where maybe we could get a government that is not imperialist? He thought both the Soviets and the Americans were imperialist. And so Cuba became kind of a fascination for him. And not necessarily Castro. Okay, his thing was just, okay, there's like a revolution over there. It's sort of communist inspired. I'd like to see what's going on there, right? So he starts to turn his attention to Cuba. And his turning his attention to Cuba and engaging in political activism in favor of Cuban independence. So he sort of joined this thing called the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which basically was a group of, more or less left-wing intellectuals basically saying, look, Cuba should be able to do what they want to do. Like, and we shouldn't take that over.
There's a lot of so he comes back to the United States. He's not interviewed by the CIA.
No.
Which is highly irregular. And so
he is interviewed by the FBI.
That's one of the things that are, but the CIA was typically taking the lead in some of these types of interviews, the way that, from what I understand. And that seemed highly irregular to everyone who looked into it later.
Yeah.
And it was a kind of one of those, it makes your antenna go up and say, well, is there something else going on here?
Yeah. Right.
And then the other thing too is the address from which he is creating these pamphlets for fair play, is right next to FBI offices of individuals connected to the FBI. Can I say, is that?
Right. Yeah. No, 544 Camp Street.
So I think what your telling of Oswald right now is like the least connected version of Oswald. Could you say that? Like we're not talking about necessarily, CIA and FBI involvement on what his actions are. This is just
we're about to get there.
Okay.
We're about to get there. Yeah, I mean the 544 Camp Street, it's the idea that, some of these pamphlets that he was passing out, he had the address stamped as 544 Camp Street, which is the same building as a group, the office of a guy named Guy Bannister, who was an ex-FBI, a huge anti-Castro, anti-communist guy. So it's weird. And people have said that they saw Oswald with Bannister and they, interacted. So, I don't want to necessarily go down that road, but that's one of the reasons people are very suspicious about those flyers. But what I wanted to get to is like, okay, when Oswald is getting into his like pro-Cuba activism, he ends up interacting with a group of Cuban exiles, known kind of in English, the Cuban Student Directorate, group of Cuban exiles. They were like the biggest organization that was in existence in the United States. They were highly militant. They wanted to get rid of Castro, and they were funded and directed by the CIA. So Oswald goes into one of the representatives of what is called the DRE and says, "Hey, look, I'm interested in running a revolution within Cuba. Like I was a Marine, I could like teach you some stuff, right?" And so the guy that he meets with sort of is a little suspicious about this guy. And he has other members of his group kind of spy on Oswald, test out his bona fides, and they basically realize, oh, he's actually not anti-Castro and anti-communism. He's kind of pro-communism. So what's significant about all that? I mean, this group, the DRE, was funded by the CIA, directed by the CIA for the use in like psychological warfare, basically like, propaganda. So Oswald ends up engaging in a highly public, dispute with them in which, they get in a fist fight. Oswald doesn't do anything. Those guys start, trying to land blows on him. They get arrested for disturbing the peace because they're pissed off because Oswald is handing out pro-Cuba pamphlets. They have a radio debate between the DRE members and Oswald. He does another interview with a very highly, CIA connected radio commentator. So it's kind of like in the course of the summer of 1963, Oswald kind of enters into a milieu of highly CIA connected people. All right. And those very same people are the ones that on the eve of the assassination make calls to major media outlets saying, we know this guy, we interacted with him, he's a Castro agent. So if you want to find like the kind of bare minimum connection without going into all these other things about, how, was he a false defector or was he and Bannister working together? At a bare minimum, he interacted with a group that was funded and directed by the CIA for the purposes of propaganda against Castro. And they utilized their interactions with him to push a narrative about Castro being behind the assassination on November 22nd.
So I guess that brings us to the question of when did the public start to think that this was a CIA operation? Or at least when did the public start to think that the CIA had something more to do with it than they were leading on?
Yeah. So that really comes about as a result of the Church Committee. So, the Church Committee, named after Frank Church, was, created as a result of revelations in the press that both the CIA and the FBI were engaged in spying on various left-wing groups, infiltrating them, trying to discredit them, that kind of stuff. And in addition to other revelations about, the CIA's involvement in, mind control programs that were designed to, can we mess with people's minds and memories to make the perfect assassin, this kind of stuff. All right. So church committee gets formed. And as the result of that church committee, it is revealed to the public that the CIA had a fairly advanced program of political assassination in their repertoire that they had developed to go against foreign leaders. And one of those parts of that program was involved in trying to assassinate Castro. And their plans to assassinate Castro involved the CIA in engaging in collaboration with the mafia to take out Fidel Castro. The mafia, was invested in this because they ran all the casinos in Cuba before Castro came to power. Mm-hmm. Now, once it was made known,
the glory days when you could get a flight, the Pan Am flight to Cuba, right?
That's
to
right.
Havana, yeah.
That's right. So once people find out that, look, the CIA and the mafia were working on assassination plots in the 60s, in the early 60s, to take out Castro, suddenly, Oswald being killed by a low-level gangster that had connections to the mafia became, significant, right? I mean, people were like, okay, well, wait a minute. Now all of a sudden looks like, there's a path now to identifying a sort of connection between Ruby, the mob, and the CIA. So yeah, I mean, that would be, I think, the first big thing. And also something very significant happened around the same time, which was that the Zapruder film was leaked to the public. Mm-hmm. So there's a famous video, Geraldo Rivera, showing it on a late night television show. And when people saw that, and they saw, the president's head move violently back into the left, everybody realized, like, well, this story about him being shot from behind is completely bogus, I mean, I can speak to this because, the reason I got into the whole Kennedy assassination was because, my dad is actually born on November 22nd, not 1963. Okay. So it's his birthday, and he was 9. He was 9 or 10. I can never remember, 9 or 10 when the assassination happened. So when I was, around that age, they were having one of these big specials about Kennedy, and my dad called me, down to the TV room and said, "Hey, I need you to watch this video and tell me where you think the bullets came from." I was like 9 or 10, right? And so
it's a gruesome film.
Yeah. So I watched it, and I was like, instantaneously, that shot came from the front. I was like totally convinced. Mm-hmm. And my dad said, the government says that it came from behind. And it's like, I mean, honestly, might be one of my...
This is how you create a conspiracy theorist.
Yes. Right? It's like, honestly, it's one of those things where it was a very formative moment. And it was so formative that the next day, I asked my mom to take me down to the used bookstore. My mom, lovely lady, and in fact, I have to mention it because she's what are they? The Golden Bears?
Yeah, Cal.
Are they the Golden
Berkeley,
Bears?
Yeah, Berkeley alum.
Yeah,
there
so
you
she's
go.
a Berkeley alum. Mid 70s. So she kind of missed some of the insanity. Well, one version of the insanity. Right. So so I asked her to take me down to the used bookstore because I wanted to get a book on Kennedy, right, on the assassination. Anyway, it was very funny going down there to the used bookstore with your little credits, because you sold a bunch of Berenstein Bear books, right? And I asked
have
the guy,
these tickets to exchange for a Kennedy assassination.
Yeah, book. And the guy, he had a ponytail, bald, that kind of guy, was like, "Oh yeah, no, I've got just the book for you." But yeah, so Zapruder film, basically, although the public was already skeptical, now they had visual evidence. Look, this looks like a shot from the front. Government story doesn't work.
Jackie climbs on the rear of the car to grab.
Yeah, what is she?
Brain
why is stuff going back that direction? So, and in the course of the HSCA, that creates this fervor for another investigation of the assassination, and so Congress forms the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and that committee reinvestigates the assassination. They go through a lot of stuff. But they ultimately conclude Kennedy was probably killed as a result of a conspiracy. So, one of the things, though, that the HSCA identified was that the CIA held back information to the Warren Commission about their interactions with Oswald, specifically this visit that he made down to Mexico City.
Yeah, what was he doing in Mexico? And this is where people start to wonder if there were multiple people going by Lee Harvey Oswald, right? Because I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but there's some sort of surveillance footage or photo of someone in Mexico City that doesn't look like Oswald.
Yeah.
But anyway, Mexico City, this bizarre trip.
Yeah, so he goes down there, allegedly, and again, there's all sorts of debates about this. He goes down there ostensibly to attain a transit visa to Cuba en route to the Soviet Union. Okay, so the idea is, I want to go down to Cuba, spend a few weeks there, and then I'll go to the Soviet Union. Part of the
just your average comparative politics at the time.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem with the whole thing is that it's sort of like, well, why did he take this route? I mean, anyway. So, but I don't want to get too sidetracked on that. What I think is most significant about it, and what the HSCA found, was that the CIA had photographic surveillance of both the Cuban embassy and the Soviet embassy. They also had the phone lines tapped. Okay, so two, big problems. One is that even though they had photographic surveillance of the Cuban embassy, everybody that was going in and out of the Cuban embassy, everybody that was going in and out of the Soviet embassy, they never got any photos of Oswald. Can you guess why?
No.
It's always the way things go, right? Like the cameras, they just didn't work.
Oh.
They just didn't work. What was that thing? What was his name? Jeffrey
Epstein was
right?
his name. Yeah.
Yeah, the cameras just didn't happen to work, right? They just didn't work. So they allegedly never got a photo of Oswald.
Here I am, my conspiratorial brain being like, somebody stole them. No, it's just the cameras didn't work.
Yeah, the cammers didn't work. Yeah.
No, just your average government incompetence, just getting in the way. Sorry about it. Nothing we can do.
Yeah, they got other pictures, just not of him.
Yeah.
So that's one weird thing. And there's actually just recently, last year, there was a CIA whistleblower that said, I went into a SCIF, one of these places where they hold all.
One of these places where they get their
all the
members of Congress get their minds changed about FISA surveillance.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right.
We've talked about them before on this show.
Exactly. So the guy said, look, I saw like a little sort of seemed like videotape or photographic film that said Lee Harvey Oswald, September 1963. So maybe it's there. That's one of the things that Trump's executive order should enable us to get towards.
Well, next time Mike Johnson goes in there and changes his mind about FISA, maybe he can grab that tape for
everybody.
He should.
But then the other thing was that they got telephone, they recorded telephone conversations. And the conversations of Oswald, they allegedly recorded conversation of Oswald calling to the Soviet embassy and asking for some kind of follow-up on, an earlier request. They also have a phone call with him with another woman who ostensibly identifies herself as a member of the Cuban consulate, calling the Soviet embassy, asking about updates. The problem with this is that the woman that Oswald was working with says, I never made any phone calls on this particular day that you're claiming, right? And the other problem is that the person is described, and the person that transcribed the call says, well, he's speaking in very broken Russian. But Oswald had pretty good Russian. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and the CIA at the time actually engaged in impersonations where they would call embassies. They would kind of like figure out from surveillance that, oh, this person is asking for X, Y, and Z. Then they would call up and sort of ask for an update on X, Y, and Z. Like we have evidence of that. Mm-hmm. So this prospect of Oswald being impersonated down in Mexico City, whether he actually went down there or whether he went down there, but he was still impersonated in these kind of Saturday morning phone calls, that blew open a lot of of suspicion. And the suspicion was so deep that Hoover, spoke to LBJ about it and was like, well, we haven't really been able to figure out what the hell's going on with this person that's impersonating Oswald down in Mexico City. And later, a couple of years later, Hoover said, look, you can't trust the CIA that much because I will never forget like the shenanigans that they had going on down there in Mexico City with Oswald. So those are some of the reasons why people started to wonder about, well, what's going on with the CIA?
And the committee concludes that there was some kind of conspiracy?
Well, yes. Yeah. The HSCA said, they think that there was probably a conspiracy to kill Kennedy.
And
but they also said that in terms of the Mexico City stuff, they mentioned these things that I'm mentioning.
Yeah, and nevertheless, this needs to remain private until the year 2029.
Right.
At least that's what they said.
Right.
Obviously, there's been a lot of declassifications since then. Moving on from that committee, public gets a little irritated.
Yeah.
Leads to the ARRB.
Right.
In the 90s, on the wake of a film by Oliver Stone,
right,
trying to make some contra myth with his film starring Kevin Costner titled JFK.
Right. Yeah.
This was a lot of the documents we have today were not supposed to see the light of day until 2029, and yet there was unanimous push by Congress to get something into the hands of the American people. And what was that process like?
Yeah, right. So, obviously there had always been a strong public support for releasing records. There has always been strong public belief in a conspiracy, and Oliver Stone's film in 1992 basically kind of just pushed everything over the edge. Massive push to Congress, and they ultimately passed the JFK Act, which requires that all government records related to the assassination be released to the public by October 2017. And so you get a massive amount of declassification as a result of that. Part of the JFK Act was to create what you mentioned, the ARB, Assassinations Record Review Board, which was a group of people independent of the intelligence community, independent of government, experts on the JFK assassination, that basically, they had the authority to identify records as assassination related. They could compel the CIA to look for things, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so, what significant stuff did they find? And I'm going to give you like a fact pattern that I think explains why people are very suspicious about possible government involvement in the assassination. So the first thing that they released, which is very significant, is the pre-assassination file that the CIA had on Oswald. And what that file reveals is that within 1 week of Oswald's defection to the USSR, James Angleton puts him on a watch list in which they're going to open any mail that goes to Oswald from the United States or comes from Oswald to the United States. And basically they're reading his mail up until at least March of 63. So from basically November 59 to March 63, the CIA is reading Oswald's mail, at least insofar as it's coming into the United States, okay? Or stuff going to him from the United States. And furthermore, what that file reveals is that it's roughly, and again, we don't know if we have everything, but at least what's released, it's like 215 pages, So they knew a lot about Lee Harvey Oswald. Okay, that's issue number one. CIA appears to have a very strong interest in what's going on with Oswald. Number two, in 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff put forward a proposal called Operation Northwoods. Operation Northwoods was a plan to conduct a variety of false flag attacks, either on military installations in Cuba or on American citizens here.
And this wasn't just false flags. This was
literal stuff.
This was we are willing to commit acts of terror on the American population. And then almost as like a side note, when you look at the document, it's like, or like we could stage it.
Yeah, right.
It's like, oh, we could do all this real stuff to harm the American public, or we could stage it as,
Yeah.
I think we should have started at least with the staging, right?
Yeah.
That should be proposal number one, is to stage it as if the Cubans are attacking American folks, American charity workers trying to help Cuban migrants or something like that.
Yeah, right.
But no.
No.
Their first response was like, what if we did some terrorism?
Yeah, right.
And then
exactly.
we could go invade Cuba.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, and one thing that I think is significant, again, for today, for our day and age, right? Like, one of their ideas was, well, what if we, planted some fake bombs that don't really go off, right? And and then we could just kind of blame them on. We'd have some people that would say, oh yeah, no, it was the Cubans that did this, right?
That's weird. I heard
can't
recently of some bombs planted.
Yeah,
in front of
that you just stopped hearing about, kind of like the Trump assassination, right? Yeah, it's like just suddenly nobody cared about them anymore.
Nobody cared about the pipe bombs at the RNC and the DNC.
Exactly. So, ARB unveiled that. So that shows you that at very high levels of government, they were invested in engaging in literal, terrorist attacks on U.S. citizens to justify or create a pretext for invasion of Cuba. Okay. All right. Great. So next thing that ARB revealed, right after the assassination, CIA officers in Mexico City, in conjunction with the ambassador to Mexico, the United States, a guy named Thomas Mann, are pushing a story from a source within the Cuban embassy that Oswald was paid money to assassinate the president. And they're pushing this to LBJ. There's a document, actually, in fact, in which they give like a list of questions about kind of lingering questions about Oswald's connection to Castro and his possibility of him being an assassin paid by Castro. They like read that to LBJ, on the night of like the 23rd. Okay.
Really?
So that's revealing that there were at least elements of the CIA that were taking very, very seriously the possibility that Castro was behind this. Ultimately, LBJ and Hoover, for a variety of reasons, basically are like, whatever, we don't care. Like, we're not interested in that story. Okay. Great. Next thing, after the assassination, the CIA, it was revealed through the ARB that the CIA engaged in a kind of investigation of the possibility of a conspiracy to kill the president orchestrated by Cuban exiles. Mm. And what's important about that is that they're not just random Cuban exiles, because the document states like, look, you need to talk to your people, your assets, because of course the CIA was coordinating all the Cuban exiles.
Right.
So basically it's like, investigate your people and whether or not they were involved with this. That's a weird thing to do if you believe in the lone gunman story. Mm-hmm. Final thing that came out also related to Cuban exiles was the fact that the CIA was running the Cuban Student Directorate. They were funding them, they were directing them, and the Cuban Student Directorate was interacting extensively with Oswald in the summer of 1963. And what's most important about that revelation was the case officer for the Cuban Student Directorate was a guy named George Ioannidis. And George Ioannidis was brought out of retirement in the 70s to serve as a liaison with the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Mm. Okay, so the House Select Committee on Assassinations was tasked to basically look at all possible angles of the assassination, including intelligence agencies, right? So they're looking into not just the CIA, but also were Cuban exiles behind this. And they were particularly interested in the DRE because the DRE had interacted extensively with Oswald.
And here's someone with incentives to
right. And so G. Robert Blakey, Notre Dame law professor, kind of a Midwest normie guy, okay, trusted the CIA. Basically, he said to the CIA, look, our guys, our researchers, they're having trouble like accessing records. Like, can we speed up this process? And so the CIA said, oh, we know a guy who knows how to find records. His name is George Joanides, right?
Uh-huh.
So, okay, so they're trying to investigate the DRE. They can't find records with respect to the DRE. And so the CIA then gives them the guy that was running the DRE during the time of the assassination. And they say, he's the guy. Now, they didn't know that. The HSCA didn't know that.
Of course not.
Right? But they're like, oh, he'll help you to find the records. But of course, this is the guy that knows where all the bodies are buried.
Right.
So that was a revelation that only occurred after the ARB. And that's why, one of the major documents that we would want to get access to, right, is all the sort of reports that Joanides made about his, activities with the DRE during the time of the assassination, which the CIA has denied to this day. They've denied access to.
And this is like if the House wanted to go back and investigate the Biden crime family, and they're like, hey, Biden crime family, we're having a really hard time accessing some of your records. Is there any way that we can speed up this process? And Joe gets on the phone and is like, my son Hunter.
Yeah, he'd be great.
Hunter, he'd be great. And so here's Hunter coordinating all of this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds so absurd, but yet it's happening time and time again. The AARB declassifies 2 million documents. Nevertheless, a lot of those documents, that JFK file in particular, and a lot of documents not considered JFK file but important to the assassination, remain from public eye. But they move up the timeline from 2029 to 2017 for all these things to be declassified.
Right.
Trump wants to declassify, Trump punts. The advice of Mike Pompeo,
the
CIA, and other more establishment figures in his administration. First off, why do you think Trump punted? And second, that delay effort had continued under the Biden administration. I mean, are presidents fearful of a similar fate?
Yeah. So I think that Trump punted, maybe like two reasons. One is that, I think he trusted Pompeo, and so people said, hey, look, I think that, we shouldn't release these things. And, that's more or less his story, right? Like, okay, yeah, they sort of gave me bad advice, right? I think also, though, there was an element of like, do I want to pick a fight with the intelligence agencies right now?
Who already wants to
want to take you down, right? I mean, the entirety of
Peter Strzok, et cetera. And all.
Yeah, I mean, your entirety of your presidency, right? I mean, you've got an agency in the CIA that has been made in the image of John Brennan, who was up to his eyeballs in this stuff with respect to Russiagate. So, I don't think that he wanted to pick, a fight with the intelligence agencies about anything during that particular period, right? So, I think both bad advice and just sort of like politically not very expedient at the time. And maybe also he didn't recognize, just how politically important it was and how potent it could be for his public support.
Right. But if the alternatives you're facing is like, I could negotiate with the Taliban and try to get some agreement on a withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Or I could release the JFK files. I think if Trump's looking at those two options, Trump prudently picked, I'm going to go with trying to end the war in Afghanistan over everyone in the military intelligence apparatus who's telling me not to do that.
Yeah, right? For sure. No, I mean,
and kudos to Biden for following through on it.
Yeah, no, seriously. Yeah. No, I mean, and I think anything in which we can withdraw from these disastrous regime change wars and putting our guys over there in situations where it's like totally impossible, I think much more important than the JFK files. Okay. So I think, he made a particular judgment there about what was going to be the best way to, advance the most important priorities. Right. And, that's fine. But I think that, he's realized now, after the, with the election and, by going on all these different, with Rogan and all that kind of, I mean, it was just pushed big time, right? Like the stuff about the JFK assassination. And, now he's got the capital to do it, right? The problem, in terms of after Trump, Trump just basically said, okay, I'll give you another 6 months or I'll give you another year and a half. the problem with Biden was that he kind of divested himself of the authority allotted to the president to decide whether or not there should be extensions. So, Biden, like
Biden divested his presidential authority to another group of individuals.
Oh, yeah, good point.
You're telling me to the first. No, I saw this. I saw this meme the other day where in DC, if you come here, you can get trinkets and trash from any gift store, but bookmarks, calendars with portraits of all the different presidents, and someone had edited like Joseph R. Biden, and it was a photo, like a stock photo of a college pamphlet where it's like everyone of every different color is Joe Biden in this administration. But yeah, so he divests his presidential authority over this.
Yeah, basically he gives it to the different agencies to come up with transparency plans. It's like a truth commission. That it's not going to actually deliver truth or transparency, and he says, well, I've done my duty under the JFK Act by kind of allowing them to create these transparency plans. So that created a situation that we're at now in terms of, I guess, the law of the land, in which the CIA and other agencies have complete control over when they're going to release documents. So I think the great, sort of hope of the Trump executive order is that whatever plan is presented to him will rescind the Biden transparency plans and will, in its place, create something akin to the ARB, in which he, kind of gives authority, or at least, is going to listen to a independent group of individuals who know about the assassination, who know about what records are outstanding, and he's going to invest them with the power to get at the truth of the assassination and allow them or empower them to, find the records that are going to complete the historical record of the assassination.
And we talked about how important, how big that transparency could be, and what it could mean at the beginning of the episode, but the major questions that Craig Iffland wants answered with the declassification of this next tranche of documents. What should people be looking out for?
Yeah. So very important. One is just, we mentioned George Ioannidis earlier. It would, a good sign of successful declassification efforts would be, have we located the records of his reports on what he was doing during the period of the assassination with the DRE? So that's like one big thing. Number two would be, what were the results of the CIA's internal investigation into the possibility of Cuban exiles being involved in the assassination? We want to see those. I mean, in that particular case, the documents that we have, the author of the memo that mentions them says, this is how you would find them. Here's where I would search within the kind of CIA offices. This is where you would find the documents. So I think, we want to see that. And then third, what we'd want to see is there is presently, and this is within the JFK collection, redacted the names of a kind of Castro assassination hit squad that would be very interesting to know. They're blacked out at the moment. So who was involved with that? Because I think that, at least in terms of the general conspiracy theory about the CIA being involved in the assassination, the kind of redirecting the teams that were involved in the Castro assassination towards Kennedy is one possibility. So I think that would be very important. But I think the final thing also is just that there's a lot of documents outstanding that help us to understand what the CIA knew about Lee Harvey Oswald prior to the assassination that, we just don't know about. I mean, and also, part of the problem is that they say, when they say like, okay, well, we have to wait until people die. Well, part of the problem with that is that if once people are dead, you can't ask them like, why did you do that? I mean, I understand, the concern about people's privacy and what have you. But look, I think if you're if you're part of the executive branch and you're working there, you can't expect complete and total anonymity 60 years after the fact. And, sometimes them waiting until people die is not about protecting their anonymity. It's about us not knowing. They don't want the public to know who might have known certain things that could reveal further leads or other things that we could know about what the CIA knew about the assassination. So, all those things and more is what I would say is most important for us to get to the bottom of in any declassification plan.
Craig Iffland, thank you so much for coming on the Signal Sit Down.
It was great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sit Down. Before you go, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review. We not only love your feedback, but it really does help the show. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works. See you next time.